So Cardano has never missed a block since 2017, which basically puts us as the most reliable infrastructure outside Bitcoin in the whole world.
How do you feel like when you're talking with governmental officials in blockchain technology, since you're very much in the conversations between the implementation of blockchain, data foundation is very much with non-profit organization?
I feel pretty good about it actually, right? Because we just worked with the Global Business Blockchain Council, which is a worldwide organization, right? And then we work with Oliver Wyman, we work with Hedera Hashcraft, with Ava Labs, JP Morgan and others. And we actually built a suggestion for a global risk management framework. One of the most important things is that there is a written down governance structure and an on-chain representation of that. And Cardano is one of the few who actually gone so far that we actually written a constitution, we validated that with an on-chain vote, right? And we are now living that constitution and the on-chain governance through smart contracts and off-chain committees. Most people speak about the community as the meme coin community or as the NFT community or as the creators or whatever, right? But they're basically lying in the value capture layer. They build on top of the blockchain. But on Cardano, it's actually the community.
Hello everyone, we welcome to the first day of Token 24/9, and I'm here with such a very special guest, Frederik, who is the CEO and the Cardano from Asia.
Likewise, I love your work. Well done.
So there's just so much to talk about. You've been in the Cardano Foundation for 5 years, and in 2023 you told Cointelegraph that Cardano is boring. We are boring because we are based on academic, peer-reviewed papers. We are sharing that across the globe. You even said that you felt incredibly proud that faster-moving blockchains were adopting Cardano's innovation. So now you're positioning Cardano as an enterprise-grade infrastructure for governments and multinationals. So has being, boring an actual competitive advantage?
I think so. I think it's all about predictability and reliability. So Cardano has never missed a block since 2017, which basically puts us as the most reliable infrastructure outside Bitcoin in the whole world. So you can take anything from Microsoft to IBM to defense systems, and all of that is down every 5 days for maintenance and patching and so on. And we haven't been, right? And what's the big difference between Bitcoin, where the power is in the stability of the source code? We changed every single line of code while thousands of companies deployed on Cardano, and we've never been down, right? So, and we've been under attack from nation states, we've been under attack from hacker groups, we've been under, all kind of distress scenarios, and the code and architecture holds, right? So I do think that actually works. Peer-reviewed research, doing things right. I think it is a competitive advantage.
But I feel like Cardano is quite different from the other blockchains because it really distinguishes itself as like public blockchain. So in that sense, how do you feel like when you're talking with governmental officials in blockchain technology, since you're very much in the conversations between the implementation of blockchain, data foundation is very much with non-profit organization?
Yeah, I feel pretty good about it actually, right? Because we just worked with the Global Business Blockchain Council, which is a worldwide organization, right? And then we work with Oliver Wyman, we work with Hedera Hashcraft, with Ava Labs, JP Morgan and others. And we actually built a suggestion for a global risk management framework. And in that risk management framework, what all these groups of large institutions and governments and then this organization came together and actually wrote was to use a public permissionless blockchain. One of the most important things is that there is a written down governance structure and an on-chain representation of that. And Cardano is one of the few who actually gone so far that we actually written a constitution. We validated that with an on-chain vote, right? And we are now living that constitution and the on-chain governance through smart contracts and off-chain committees. And that is actually something which large players like, because it reminds them of the corporate governance you see in normal risk mitigation frameworks. And that means that we are slowly but surely sort of bridging that world. And that makes us very attractive for these people.
Especially that now the goal is not just to onboard people on the blockchain, but to also make it very intuitive and easy that the user does not even know that they're interacting with the blockchain. Like you see in Dubai, that all the passports are recorded on the blockchain. So is there something that Cardano is currently working on that is related to, supporting institutions or governments that?
Certainly there is. So in Germany, for instance, we just actually reached the milestone that we have 500 classical SME corporates who's using the Cardano blockchain, and most of them actually don't know it. So what's actually happening, right? So what's happening is that they use agentic AI, right? So basically they have these tasks which can be delegated between different agents, right? And when you want to delegate something to a company which is not a part of your company, they basically have the ability to find those agents, to get access to that data without exposing the data, because it has to be EU GDPR compliant, right? And to do that, you actually need to have an ID. So every single agent or AI needs an ID, right? It has to be a very secure ID, but it also needs a verified credential. A verified credential, or VC as we call it in blockchain lingo, right? It's basically that the agent does represent you and your data without showing me your data, because otherwise I don't know if the agent actually has the right data set, right? And then last but not least, if you have two different agents, right? One might have more CPU than the other, and that means you can do a brute force attack basically on this. So what you need to get to a situation that there is some incentives who ensures that you cannot do a brute force attack on one agent and then prompt around it, right? And then these agents need to find each other, and there needs to be a good activity log or audit log, which the regulator does. And all of that actually happens on Cardano, which is quite unique. But these companies don't actually know it's happening on Cardano, because Cardano is the security and the collaboration layer, but it's not about tokens and a token economy. And these incentives I spoke about in the payments is a MiCA compliant stablecoin on Cardano called USDM. But that's not what they care about, right? They really just care about that they can delegate these things among different companies, and with that they can fight this sort of, global Excel spreadsheet thing, that if it's not in one spreadsheet, it doesn't work, right? So 500 corporates is on Cardano, and most of them don't even know it, using exponential technology and AI, getting the utility.
It's an amazing achievement, especially if it's 500 startups, definitely scale.
Oh, it's not startups. This is established large companies. I think some of the names has already been published. The company who runs is called Masumi, and some of these, is really established German brands, right? The thing about large industrial companies who's been around for generations in Germany, who's suddenly on blockchain because they get the utility of the security and the collaboration layer.
Why did you choose Germany?
Actually, we didn't. We just helped, right? We help around the world, right? But there's a very large company in Germany called Service Plan. It has 7,000 people, and they're the largest marketing agency in Germany. And worldwide, if you see a BMW commercial, it will be them who's done it, right? And we spoke to the founder there, right? And the owner, and he basically said, you know what, this technology is going to disrupt my business model. So I have two options, right? Either I fire a lot of people, or I do a strategic bet to ensure that I can employ the same amount of people and actually give back to the community which I'm serving. Is a very, European German-based company, right? Even though it's worldwide, and that's where blockchain and Cardano was a natural fit. However, they were actually an Ethereum house, so actually the developers they had for blockchain were all Solidity developers. So one of the first sort of journeys was, why Cardano, not Ethereum, right? And then you need to convince the devs as well, because the developer experience might be very different, right? And to my great surprise, they reached out to me and said, yeah, we need just a little bit of help. We're nearly there with changing the minds of the developers. And what they really, really care about is what I said before: predictability, reliability. They care about our messaging. If you go in on the Cardano Foundation's website, you will find it extremely corporate, not very crypto. And that's because, when these companies around the world do due diligence and compliance, they need somebody to interact with, somebody where they go on a web page where they feel at home as a Web2 company or as an industry company.
So what do you think regarding the core features of Cardano? What would make him very much stand out? He mentioned his own privacy, about scalability. What's one thing that makes Cardano the number one blockchain somewhere for us?
I think there's a whole range of things, and it really depends on who you're speaking to, right? But for me, what really stands out is the community. And I think a lot of people say that, right? But the community have different roles in different blockchains. And what's quite unique about Cardano is that our community is actually the one who runs the blockchain. Most people speak about the community as the meme coin community or as the NFT community or as the creators or whatever, right? But they're basically lying in the value capture layer. They build on top of the blockchain. But on Cardano, it's actually the community. It's not the foundation who run the blockchain. It's not, the technology company or something like that. It's the actual community who runs the blockchain. They get up in the middle of the night when something is wrong to restart the servers and the relays, right? And it's the actual community who goes together and decides over our treasury. And our treasury is not by, one white guy sitting in Zug who decides over everything. Our treasury is actually managed by the community. And it's, it's $1.5 billion big. And the community comes together and they vote on that in an orchestrated digital vote, which most countries actually don't have the same security level on, right? Digital identity, we have different variations of quadratic voting and stuff like that, right? And this is something where, countries are looking at it right now and say, oh, I wish I had that. So I think what's really truly unique is this community is not just there to reap the benefits, right? They're actually running it.
That's amazing to hear, especially that we're kind of like losing the essence on decentralization. A lot of corporates are putting their hands on blockchain. So I love the fact that you guys are very much community-centric about regards. So there's another question I had in mind for you, because I know that Cardano has been focusing so much
Yeah.
and a lot of different initiatives. And so what have you kind of learned about deploying blockchain solutions in emerging markets so far, especially like in Africa? It's probably one of the most successful, countries. They have a great implementation of cross-border payments. They were one of the first implements that solution.
I think the first thing we learned is it's really hard. Because if you want to do something really in the engine room, you need a stable government. And unfortunately, many African countries has not been so lucky to have super stable governments. But on the positive note, what we see here is that crypto is way more accepted and digital payments are way more accepted than, for instance, in Europe or in the US, right? So I think that's something that really, speaks to us and specifically to Bitcoin and Cardano's ADA, right? Because it's built on really sound first level principles. It doesn't go out and, mint coins extra. It's not like a printing press as they know, right? So it has real solid value and it's incredible stable compared to many other, coins out there. The second thing we learned is identity is extremely important. Your ability to represent identity and create economic identity for the people who don't have it is incredibly important, right? So this is, we spoke in the old days about banking the unbanked, right? And this is actually happening slowly but surely through your cell phone and blockchains there, that you can create an economic footprint, that you can show that you are good at paying back your mortgage or you're good at doing certain things where there is no registry or trail, right? A good example is in two countries in Africa. One of our great projects called Landano has actually gone from village to village. I think it's over 1,000 villages, and basically convinced the village chiefs to basically start registering the property, so the land register, because there's not a centralized land register in the country, to basically register that on the blockchain. And what normally happens if the village elder is the one who basically holds the lecture for the land registry of this little commune, right, is that when you run out of money, right, you look around and you're like, you might be 50 or 100 fighting male, right? And the other village, they have a little bit more land, but they're only 20. You're like, suddenly you move, right? And what we can actually see now is that Landano has been, able to create an economic history of who owns what, even though it's not the nation state who does that, who basically allows security that you actually can prove that you have a history of owning that property, which means that it reduces also not just crime, but, village wars, basically. So it basically creates peace, right? And I think we sometimes forget, these real use cases for blockchain based on these short-term gratification. And then the third thing we learned is education is extremely important. The ability to give high quality, free education which also focus on the economic opportunities that people don't have to leave their village, but they can stay in the area and they can run a node on Cardano, because you can actually run that on a little bit of an advanced Raspberry Pi for $100, right? And you can get a micro financing for the $100 using the Cardano blockchain, right? So you can basically get a loan, you can build up your identity, getting that, you get the free education, and you can participate in that as long as you have an internet connection, right? So the way we design Cardano is that you haven't designed it that only the people who has this, great access to technology can use it and get economic opportunities, but we actually keep fighting for a situation that wherever you are in the world, whatever kind of identity or no identity you have, whoever says you are in or out, you can participate in these economic opportunities and you can participate on Cardano. And that's been a rough fight specifically from the foundation, because that's obviously, when you go to a big country, right, they always have, that's the terrorist, or that's the bad, or, they're on the blacklist, right? So trying to fight that everybody should have access to equal technology, like originally Bitcoin was intended, right, and still is, right, makes us also quite rare, actually, that we still believe in that, and also we are still around.
That's such a great anecdote about land ownership, identity, and it seems like, especially in Africa, it's one of the most important things. So we're kind of solving a bigger problem of society as well. So let's kind of dive into real world assets, because we have the Genius Act. It's been implemented this year. Also, Hong Kong has the stablecoin bill very recently, and Cardano has already pivoted $10 million in tokenized real world assets with Members Cap. And you are now integrating Cloudflare's X402 payments framework through Masumi network, while placing formal RWA issuance standards. So what kind of type of real world assets do you see as kind of killer apps for Cardano, and how do you ensure that these tokenized assets kind of remain compliant across a different jurisdiction?
Yeah, I mean, there's real world assets and there's real world assets, right? Like we say, there's crypto and there's crypto, right? And I think there's a really big difference in the quality of it. And, we for a very long time actually had real world assets on Cardano, from diamonds to granite to gold and so on. But a lot of that was, stored in specific facilities, and there was a regulated counterparty who basically allowed you to say, okay, I own X amount of grams or kilos of gold. And then you can actually, on the blockchain, verify that, but you can also make a claim. And wherever you are in Europe, they will basically send you, depending on how much gold it is, they will either send an armed escort or they'll send you the gold with the post, right? So we very early on made that connection between, commodities and different types of real world assets being represented, right? Also, and what's really unique about Members Cap is that we went completely off the limit, right? And we said, how do we democratize access to asset classes normal people don't have access to? And reinsurance is a really good example of that. So normally, if you want to have exposure in reinsurance, it's $100 million ticket. And when we look at the vision and the mission for the Cardano Foundation about enabling everybody to have equal access, we were like, is there a way that we could actually tokenize real world assets in the reinsurance space and lower the entry barrier that it gets possible, right? Now, what you saw when we rang the bell on the London Stock Exchange was $10 million, right? Which was tokenized as the first tranche in this fund, right? And you saw that's fully represented on the Cardano blockchain. And again, here we took a different path, right? So what we said is it has to be multi-chain. So probably what you're going to see is Solana and other blockchains also be adding to that, because we truly believe that inter-chain collaboration is important. It's not about Cardano. It's about how we enable a blockchain-based economy. And our hope is in November that we can get the entry ticket into this reinsurance to go down in the area of 50 to 100K. Now, 50 to 100K is still a lot, but compared to the 100 million and no way you can get into it, we are starting to get to a situation where we can actually prove the utility, right? We can prove the value. And the fact that we got this listed on the London Stock Exchange through Arcax and Fireblocks as providers, right? And with the Cardano blockchain also shows the resistance and resilience and the approval rate we have on Cardano, right? Because nobody else has actually done something like that on a tier one equity exchange, right? So we believe these 10 million is probably going to get to, I don't know, something like half a yard or something like that, fairly quickly as this, barrier to entry lowers and we get multi-chain support, right? But it's also quite rare that you're actually hearing somebody from a layer one blockchain talking about, it's actually important that we also support other blockchains in these kind of use cases.
100%. And between the liquidity fund proposal and expanding stablecoin adoption, Cardano seems to be a serious player when it comes to DeFi. So regarding this, how do you kind of see the narrative shifting? Because you have the enterprise infrastructure and you also have governmental partnerships. What is kind of the main topic right now? Because regulation seems to be shifting. We have more clear frameworks. What is like the more, let's say, discussions that you're having with these institutions?
I mean, the Cardano Foundation is about three things, right? It's about operational resilience, ensuring that you can believe that Cardano exists also in 20 years, even though it's decentralized to the max, and that the community actually runs it, right? And this is really, really hard. And to do that, we need to ensure that the regulators and policymakers, but also the general education level goes up. We spoke a little bit about that, right? And the last is adoption. And the way we think about adoption is we think about, block production. We really think about transaction fees. So when you look at how the blockchain economy actually works is that, to do something on the blockchain, you pay a transaction fee. And if you do something for the blockchain, like you participate in the security, which is what we call staking, right? We have liquid staking on Cardano. Or if you run a stake pool, or if you build something and you get a grant from the treasury, right? You withdraw some of the money which was made on the transaction fees. And what we are trying to get to is a situation that we can get to equilibrium, that the amount of transactions fees which is paid is matching what is being paid out. Luckily, we have about 10 billion ADA in reserves, right? So we have a long, expansion rate, right? So we have time. But what we think about really is how do we enable that? How do we get to a situation that we can actually prove that there's real clients who buy real products and real services, who lives or is enabled by the blockchain? And therefore, one of the things we looked at is we saw, okay, the Cardano ecosystem's DeFi actually is very solid, as you say, but in comparison to some other blockchains is relatively small based on TVL or based on transaction volume. So we said, can we short term create a better user experience at large for the DeFi players without competing with them? And that's actually what some of these proposals are about, and that's about what we're going to implement. Is really how do we increase the user experience at large for people who go to these DeFi players without competing with a DEX or with a lending protocol on Cardano.
Especially education, you mentioned this part because Cardano just launched 30 minutes staking rewards and calculation course to help ADA holders understand, how reward flows through the network. So staking is often cited as, Cardano's competitive advantage. You're not very much focusing on making it a larger scale, but you're still kind of implementing more beneficial economic mechanisms. So why do you think transparency around these economic mechanisms matter for long-term adoption? And what kind of surprised you most about what users didn't understand? Or actually what were big or
So let me start somewhere else, right? So I'm a true believer that you should use your own technology. So the Cardano Foundation actually has a small holding structure and 3 sub-entities. And for 2024, so last year, we did over 50,000 financial transactions. My salary, rental costs, going to token, all of that basically adds up to what we think about as a balance sheet and a P&L statement. Now, most of the foundations don't disclose this at all. And if they disclose it, they disclose some kind of a transparency report. What we actually did is we put all of these transactions on the Cardano blockchain. So we basically have the full transaction overview of everything we did in the Cardano Foundation. And then we put the balance sheet and the earnings statement there so you can actually compile the balance sheet and the earnings statement yourself and get, basically we're making everybody who wants to be an auditor of the Cardano Foundation to be an auditor if they want to, using blockchain technology. But that does also, it creates benchmarks for how much the things cost. So we basically created the most popular smart contracting language on Cardano today. It's called Icon, it's in Rust. is a better developer experience than Solidity, for instance, even though we have a UTXO-based model, which makes it a little bit harder to compile a transaction, but the Rust-based language is amazing. So if you're looking for, let's say, okay, what does it actually cost to do something like that? You can actually go on the blockchain and figure that out. Now, the reason why we did this reward calculator is because Cardano is truly unique in this aspect that we have this $10 billion reserves plus a $1.5 billion decentralized treasury, right? And we have something which is called economic parameters who controls the economic equilibrium on Cardano. So what is the, think about it as the halving period on Bitcoin, right? On Cardano, that's every 5 days, right? What is the optimal amount of stake pools? How much goes from the reserves into the treasury? All those things are in different parameters. And these were originally created in 2017, where there was only a transaction ledger, right? And, there was people who were believing in Cardano, but there was not 1,000 companies on Cardano as we see today. So fast forward to today, right? With 7-8 million inhabitants who all have digital identity and they vote on the treasury disbursement, but they also vote on these protocol parameters. So for me, what was really important was to teach people about if you move X, then Y happens. If Y is happening, maybe people do something different. And it's just a little bit like a political situation. Actually, Cardano is like a country today, which actually is larger than Switzerland if you think about the inhabitants, right? And politics are really, really difficult, right? Sometimes you're burning for a thing, but if you do that, it has some unintended consequences. So we've been working for a very long time with University of Zurich and others who is very deep into social science and also into economics to basically see how the human factor on the blockchain has an influence. So we might say we do something, but when we actually vote, we do something different, capturing that there, teaching people about these economic parameters. If you want to earn more in rewards, what would that mean in terms of the disbursements from the treasury and the burnout rate, right? If you think that you want Y, then Z is also happening. And, this might be sort of overdoing it a bit, right? Because we're sort of teaching economics in a real light nation state, right? But this is actually the opportunity we give to people. There's so many places around the world where you cannot vote, you cannot participate in democracy. There's sitting one king who decides everything, right? And you can only vote with your feet, but if you don't have a passport, how can you move to the next country? You cannot really prove that you actually are a nurse or a fisherman because, all that type of the identity was managed by, maybe even not even papers, but basically on your dad saying you could do that, right? And Cardano enables all of those things. And I think that's like how you change the social systems and the financial systems of the world. But that is not like headline material, right? It is predictable, reliable, it's hard work, it's walking those villages to village to convince them to put things on a blockchain they never saw or touched or heard about, right? Being able to prove that things, right? And but we're walking that long road and we keep walking it, and it's truly amazing.
It is very amazing building like a social system using blockchain, which is very, very inspiring. I would like to share with you, Frederik, this special cover. And we have a very maybe familiar face who's also the calendar of Cardano Foundation, Charles Heskinson. I think, we're very much looking forward to see your impact at the Cardano Foundation, how it can improve people's lives, especially in emerging markets. Thank you so much for listening.
You're more than welcome. And if you're interested, we have a summit in Berlin in November. So it's going to be very focused about, Cardano, obviously, but we're going to have a lot of these classical enterprises who's actually suddenly using blockchain without actually knowing it coming. And it's a good place if you're a developer or you run an application and you want to speak to classical enterprises who's suddenly starting to find real value in blockchain use cases, to share your minds, to get funding, to kind of interact with the Cardano community. You need to go to Berlin in November.
In November. Okay, well, we'll see you in November at Cardano Summit.
Cool. Likewise.